Nature Revisited. Nature Revisited is a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we welcome Rowan Jacobsen to the podcast. Rowan Jacobsen is the author of the new book, In Defense of Sunlight, The Surprising Science of Sun Exposure. Rowan is an author and journalist whose writings have focused on nature, science, and sustainability. Rowan is the author of A Geography of Oysters, a James Beard Award winner, and more recently, The Essential Oyster, a salty appreciation of taste and temptation. His recent book, Truffle Hound, On the Trail of the World's Most Seductive Scent, with dreamers, schemers, and some extraordinary dogs, was named 2021 Best Nonfiction of the Year. In the book, In Defense of Sunlight, Rowan Jacobsen presents the growing body of medical research that reveals the many health benefits of the sun. Part science examination and part cultural reckoning, In Defense of Sunlight reveals how outdated science and aggressive marketing have misguided our guidelines to sun exposure. Rowan joins me from his home in Vermont to speak in defense of sunlight. So Rowan, welcome to Nature Revisited.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's a pleasure having you on the podcast, talking about your new book, In Defense of Sunlight, The Surprising Science of Sun Exposure. So let's start with, why does the sunlight need defending?
I'm so glad you're asking. That's something I've been thinking about a lot. It seems odd that something that is built into the nature of everything on this planet should need defending. The short answer is that close to 100 years ago, we started to get some signs that too much sunlight could increase our risk of skin cancer. And at the time, that was one of the few things we knew sunlight did. As cases of skin cancer grew throughout the 20th century, doctors started warning people to try to get less and less sun exposure. And we're now at a point where the pendulum has swung so far to one side that the standard recommendation is to get zero sun exposure and never go outside without proper protection against the sun. The more I looked into the science of that, the more I realized that probably we had gone way too far in that direction based on all the science that's come to light since then. It was time for somebody to make a case for the sun, because nobody was.
When and why did you decide it necessary to write In Defense of Sunlight?
It all started back in 2017 and 2018. I was doing a night science journalism fellowship at MIT, one-year position where you're paid a salary to not write. You're not allowed to publish during that year. And the idea is that you will just dive deep into science and really become an expert on subjects that are too often written about by people who don't fully understand them. Then a couple of studies came to light that involved sun exposure and its effects on the body that really got my attention. Then I did do the deep dive into the literature on sun exposure. It was so different than most of us are led to believe that I started to change my understanding of how the whole system worked. And I thought it was an important subject to pull all the pieces together and try to present a holistic story.
So, how and when did we come to overturn our initial instincts when it comes to sunlight?
You've hit on an important point, which is that I think most of us do have this natural instinct that's positive toward the sun. We're drawn to it. It feels good when we get it. And we now know, actually, that the body produces endorphins when the skin is hit by sunlight as a feedback mechanism to encourage us to seek it. We're naturally drawn to it. And for most of history, people believed that sun exposure was good for you. And then it really started to change in the 1920s, 1930s, when doctors started to realize that all that ultraviolet light that's in the sun could contribute to skin cancer. Before the 20th century, skin cancer was a rarity. You would see it in sailors, people who got a ton of sun exposure during their normal working lives. But you didn't really see it very often in other populations. And then something happened in the 20th century where rates of skin cancer started to go way up. It wasn't because we were getting more sun exposure. Often people were getting less as we migrated from outdoor life to factory work or white-collar indoor jobs. During that migration from outdoor life to indoor life, rates of skin cancer went way up. And as doctors started to investigate the mechanisms in a lab, they would see that if they took a UV lamp and zapped a mouse with a whole lot of ultraviolet light, they could cause tumors to grow on the mouse. So that was their first hint that the ultraviolet light in sunlight might be exacerbating skin cancer. For a while, through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the standard recommendation was too much sun might raise your risk of skin cancer, but don't sweat the small stuff. Part of the problem was that in the 1930s, people started thinking that even burning was good for you. They kind of got over exuberant in their love of sunlight. We had this funny period through the 1930s when a lot of people were getting way too much ultraviolet light. And then rates of skin cancer were going up through the middle part of the century and kept going up through the 60s and the 70s. Then sunscreen came in and people started using more and more sunscreen. Rates of skin cancer kept going up. That's why the messaging kept getting more and more strenuous, where doctors eventually just started telling people to stay away from the sun altogether. And that's where we were by the early 2000s.
So, what is the truth about skin cancers and melanoma?
That's an important part of the story to understand, is that melanoma is only one of the main types of skin cancer. And there's really three that we tend to talk about: melanoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and basal cell carcinoma. And the two carcinomas are responsible for about 98, 99% of skin cancers, with melanoma being the other 1 or 2%. And they are very, very different in both their causes and their effects. Squamous cell carcinoma and basal cell carcinoma are way more common than any other cancers in the world. 5 million cases a year in the U.S. And they don't tend to have major health implications. But then melanoma is the one you do need to worry about. It's the one that is more likely to be fatal. It's still not a huge risk. It's responsible for maybe 7,000 or 8,000 deaths a year. The funny thing is the carcinomas, especially squamous cell carcinoma, it's clear that they're connected with overall lifetime exposure to the sun. If you have enough hours out there on the golf course, pretty likely to eventually get either an SCC or a BCC, probably no health implications there. Melanoma is not associated with cumulative sun exposure, and this is surprising to a lot of people, even to a lot of researchers. It is only lightly associated with sun exposure at all. It seems to be associated with intermittent sun exposure, particularly among people who have very fair skin, where they have red hair and reddish-orangish freckles and maybe moles. If you have that phenotype, you're much more likely to get melanoma. People with darker skin, darker hair do not get very many melanomas at all. So there's a real big difference. Melanoma is the one that we really mostly need to pay attention to.
So who is Dr. Richard Weller And how does he fit into this story?
Richard Weller is an important figure in this story. He was the first expert dermatologist I saw who was beginning to openly question the conventional wisdom about sun exposure. The reason he was doing that was because his area of expertise had been nitric oxide formation. So he's a dermatologist in Scotland. He had discovered that the skin produces a lot of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is simple gas that's used as a signaling molecule throughout the body. And one thing it actually does is it's well known to dilate blood vessels. It's produced inside the body, and that's how people were used to thinking about it. But Weller had discovered that a lot of it is coming off the skin, and it seemed to be produced by the skin, and no one could understand why. What they finally figured out was that the skin is full of nitrates, which we get in our diet, and those nitrates get stored in the skin, and then when they're hit by sunlight, break down into nitric oxide. That made Weller very curious because he thought sunlight hits skin and produces nitric oxide, and that's where the nitric oxide is coming from. And if nitric oxide is known to lower blood pressure, would that mean that sun hitting skin lowers blood pressure? And one of the reasons he thought that might be possible is because it's well known that blood pressure is higher in winter and lower in summer, anywhere other than the equator. And he didn't know if nitric oxide was responsible, but he decided to test it. He recruited a bunch of his grad students and shined ultraviolet light on their skin. And it was the equivalent of like 30 minutes of summer sun. And sure enough, it lowered their blood pressure by 5 points. And 5 points is not massive, but because high blood pressure is associated with heart attacks and strokes and other cardiovascular illnesses, which are the biggest causes of death from chronic disease in the world, lowering blood pressure by 5 points across the board could actually save millions of lives. From the research he did, he suddenly realized that more sun exposure would save a whole lot of deaths from cardiovascular disease. He was a good dermatologist. He understood that more sun exposure could also raise your risk of skin cancer. But he was the first person to come out and say, skin cancer is bad. We'd love it if it didn't exist, but it doesn't kill very many people at all. Cardiovascular disease literally kills more than 100 times more people. So if we have a situation that can slightly raise the risk of the not very dangerous disease and lower the risk of the very dangerous disease, could that be a good trade-off? Got a lot of flack for that, but he kept doing more research that made it very clear that it was a trade-off. And he even went ahead and did a TED Talk about it. And that TED Talk was one of the first things that started to change my own understanding of this. So for all those reasons, he's a figure that annoys some other people in the dermatology community, but he is increasingly being seen as one of the first people to really wrap their heads thoroughly around this whole issue.
How is the Lowell Health House in Los Angeles the ultra representation of what was nationally considered the health benefits of sunlight, also known as the helotherapy era?
This is what I was referring to before about things getting a little out of hand in the 20s and 30s. And this is a famous house in LA called the Lowell Health House. You can find it. It's up on the hills, kind of near the Griffith Observatory in LA. Stunning house, designed and built by a very famous architect named Richard Neutra. And it was one of the actual first famous houses of the modernist architectural era. Probably one of the most famous houses in the country. When it was built in 1929, there was nothing like it. So even though it's famous in architecture circles today, most architects don't understand or don't remember is that it was designed entirely for health, and that health was all about the sun. And it was built for a very funny character named Philip Lovell, who was a naturopath in LA in the 1920s and 30s. He also wrote a column in the Los Angeles Times called Care of the Body. And the big things for him were vegetarian diet, exercise, sun exposure, a lot of sunbathing, a major proponent of sunbathing. And this was all coming out of the tuberculosis era of the late 1800s. People discovered that sunlight could actually cure cutaneous tuberculosis. cure rickets. They started to think maybe sunlight could cure everything. They really started to think of it as just a panacea, that it would cure everything. And Philip Lovell was definitely one of these guys who thought it could cure everything. So he preached to everybody in LA that they needed flat roofs where they could sunbathe. And if not that, then go find somewhere else where you could sunbathe. And he practiced it himself. He hired Richard Neutra to build himself the perfect display house that would embody everything that he preached. The house is all glass, and the glass was actually designed to let in ultraviolet light, which that was a mistake. It had flat roofs for sunbathing. It had big open spaces for exposure to the sun and to let fresh air go through. So it's fun to go look at this house and get this reminder that not that long ago, the sun was considered the ultimate healing benefit. And actually, a lot of people came to LA. Part of the reason LA boomed in that era was because it was considered such a healthy place to be. Back in the early part of the 20th century, many, many people came there to cure their illnesses because the climate, especially the light, was considered so good for you.
So can you talk about vitamin D and the Swedish paradox?
The thing that's happened with sunlight is that all these different threads have come together, and each one by itself isn't enough to overturn the current paradigm. But once you put them all together, a very clear picture emerges, and it starts to tell the story that I tell in my book. And one of these really important pieces of evidence is what's known as the Swedish paradox. Women in Sweden who seek the sun, who get more sun, have far lower rates of disease than women who avoid the sun. And that's a paradox only because they are told to avoid the sun because it's so unhealthy for them. The way that paradox was discovered was kind of by accident. One of the things you see in my book repeatedly is that the doctors who discovered the health benefits of sunlight were not looking to do so. Sort of looking at something else, and accidentally, out of their research, emerged this very clear picture that the sun was good for you. So that's what happened in Sweden with an obstetrician named Pelle Lindqvist. Like I said, he's an obstetrician, and he's an expert in thromboembolism, so blood clots. So he was investigating factors that would make blood clots more or less likely. And one of them seemed to be inflammation. Rates of blood clots are higher in the winter than in the summer, and rates of inflammation are higher in the winter than in the summer. He thought maybe vitamin D was the mediator there. We all know vitamin D is produced in the skin by sunlight. So his hunch was that, okay, maybe in summer, more sun hits skin, more vitamin D gets made. That lowers your inflammation, and that's why you have fewer blood clots. At first, he didn't have a way to test it, but then he discovered that there'd been this long-term study in Sweden called the Melanoma in Southern Sweden study that had been ongoing for like 20 years, involving 40,000 women. So this great data set. That study was trying to determine what the risk factors were for melanoma. One of the pieces of that was they asked women about their sunbathing habits. Did they sunbathe in winter? Did they sunbathe in summer? So it was a very thorough data set of women's health and of their sun habits. Pelle Lindqvist was like, hallelujah, now I can finally answer my question. He looked at the data, and sure enough, women who had the most sun-seeking behaviors had much lower rates of blood clots. So then he thought, well, would it be true for other cardiovascular conditions? So then he looked at diabetes. Sure enough, same thing. Women who actively sought the sun had like half the rate of diabetes of women who avoided the sun. So then, knowing that cardiovascular conditions are the number one killer, he decided to just look at overall mortality. And the numbers were shocking. The women who were sun seekers were half as likely to die over the 8 years of follow-up of the study than women who were sun avoiders. So he's just a data guy. He didn't have any particular dog in the hunt. He just wrote up these papers and he said, sun-seeking, it looks like it cuts your risk of death in half. So that got a ton of attention, pushback from some people in the dermatology world who didn't want that to be a message going out there. But he kind of stuck to his guns, and he checked to make sure that there were no confounders involved. Because one thing people tend to say, the women who are seeking the sun, who are going away on a holiday and vacation, they're healthier, but it's not because the sunlight, it's because they're going outside more because they're healthier or they're richer. There's other reasons that could be explaining their good health. So he checked all of that stuff, checked against smoking, against exercise, against socioeconomic factors. It was still clear that the people being outside in the sun were clearly doing way better. The tide started to turn in a way between Richard Weller's work and Pele Linkovic's work. Suddenly there was clear evidence that the sun was good for you. So then people started to take it more seriously and try to figure out why, what was going on.
So can you talk about not just the UV light that we get from the sun, but infrared light as well?
Yeah, great question. I think people don't realize how important infrared is when it comes to sunlight. And just to back up a little bit, when we look at the sun, we think of that white as being white, basically. It includes all the visual colors, the full spectrum, the full rainbow, as you can tell if you put sunlight through a prism. It also includes a lot of light that we can't see with our eyes, and that includes the ultraviolet light, which is very short wavelength, high energy light. And then it also includes a huge amount of infrared light, which is very long wavelength, low energy light. About 4% of the light in the sun is UV. About 47% is visible light. And then the other half is infrared. So infrared makes up the biggest part of the sun. Even though we can't see it, those rays are shining down on us anytime we're outside. And anytime we're inside, we're getting almost no infrared exposure. The infrared light has some really interesting qualities to it. It's long wavelength, low energy. So every one of those photons in infrared light doesn't have a whole lot of energy to it. So it doesn't do any damage in the body. The reason UV light is a problem is because it's very high energy. So if it hits your DNA molecule, it can actually break one of the bonds in your DNA molecule. Infrared light is very low energy, so it doesn't do anything like that. It's also able to penetrate much deeper into the body, in part because it has that long wavelength and low energy. It tends to get pretty far into the body, just sort of scattering before it finally hits a molecule that can absorb it. That turns into heat. The reason that the sun feels warm to us is especially because of the infrared light. In addition to just creating warmth, creating heat, thermal energy, those infrared photons can be absorbed by certain molecules in the body, especially molecules that are contained in our mitochondria, which are the little energy-producing structures in our cells. It looks like infrared makes them work a little bit better. Metabolism go a little bit better. As mitochondria go, so goes our health. That leads to longevity and lower rates of disease.
Can you address some of the spiritual aspects of the sun's light on our health?
I think that's a really important part of the whole question. We know that the sun has been worshipped by different cultures since as long as there's been culture. It provides all the light and energy that fuels all life on the planet. One of the things that I really started thinking about more as I was working on my book is that energy really directly becomes us. If you follow that energy, the cycle of it starts in the sun, and those photons come to Earth and get absorbed by plants. And then that plant gets eaten by an animal or eaten by us. But eventually that energy is all finding its way into us. So we literally are these photons, and our entire consciousness, basically almost like a standing wave of energy, of light energy that powers through us all the time. The more I worked on the book, the more I become aware of how all these photons, without them, I'm just fancy mud, basically. Rather than shying away from that light energy, it just made me realize that how anytime I'm outside, this stuff is entering me and becoming me. It really helps connect you to this energy flow that is really the entire solar system.
You say in the book that one of the ways for you of getting right with light was making friends with the dark. Why did you go to the Sonoran Desert, and what did you learn?
So far, we've been talking about all the ways that light can impact the body through the skin, but of course, probably the very most important way that light impacts the body is through the eyes. And we know that because we sleep when it's dark and we're awake when it's light. over the past 10 years or so, there's this really important body of work that has really come to the fore about circadian rhythms and how light influences them. During the day, the more light you have, the more alert you're going to be, the more active you're going to be. During the night, you want just the opposite. We also need to rest and repair. That diurnal swing of light and dark is incredibly important. The dark is as important as the light. Scientists have increasingly realized is that the dark part of that equation is really endangered more and more in the modern world due to artificial light at night. So more and more of the planet is being lit up at night, and fewer of us experience the true dark that we always did in our evolutionary past. The way that works is through melatonin. Even small or modest amounts of light in the evening can suppress that melatonin production and interfere with our sleep. But there's all these terrible metabolic problems that are downstream of that. The more I was reading on this subject, the more I realized artificial light at night is a tremendous problem worldwide and growing because there's more and more light at night. And it was personal for me. I was definitely having insomnia in the middle of the night. So while I was working on this book, it suddenly became fairly obvious to me that part of the issue might be light at night. If I really did experience darkness like we did in the past, would that have any effect on my insomnia? So I wanted to experiment, find out. So I wanted to go somewhere incredibly dark at night where I could actually enjoy that environment. So I ended up picking the Sonoran Desert, south of Tucson. I rented an old 1960s Airstream out there. So it was incredibly dark at night. Days were normal. I could work on my laptop because there's tons of light everywhere during the day. Once the sun set, that was it. For a month, I lived out there. Once it would get dark, I could lie out and watch the stars. I could hike around in the dark in the desert. But that was about it. No reading, no flashlights, no nothing. It was an interesting experiment. For the first part of it, just having the dark nights, I still had the insomnia at night. It wasn't quite as bad, but I was still waking up for a couple of hours. So then for the second half of the trip was getting out and just climbing mountains during the day. So then I had this huge contrast in amplitude between the days and the nights, where the nights were really dark, but the days were really bright. I was exposed to intense outside light for hours during the day. And then my insomnia disappeared. Since then, I've seen some studies that have shown that that amplitude is as important as the dark night for sleep and for other metabolic health.
So you say in the book, the time is right for a more enlightened conversation about sun exposure. Has that conversation started?
It has, actually. It's really been moving forward quickly, and sort of in both good and bad ways, I would say. People have exposure to a lot of different information from different sources. There's a lot of information out there about sunlight and why it might be good for you. Some of it is coming from responsible sources. Some of it is coming from online influencers who might not really understand the big picture or who might not care. But at the same time, conventional institutions are starting to change their tune on sunlight. What really surprised me was Australia. One of the really important factors in sun exposure is skin tone. You can't tell people who have really pale skin and people who have really dark skin that they need to get the same amount of sunlight, because what works for one is not going to work for the other. So Australia broke their recommendations into 3 categories. One for people with pale skin, one for people with really dark skin, and one for people who are in the middle. I think that's what needs to happen everywhere. The other part of this that's interesting is that you're seeing fewer and fewer people say never, ever get sun exposure. The recognition that a little bit of sun is for everybody is definitely growing, and I think will become the norm in the coming years.
So lastly, what would you advise people who want to change their relationship with the sun's light?
Also a great question. Again, I think one of the big takeaways is there's no one size fits all. Do what makes sense for you. Talk about it with your doctor or do your own research. You can read my book. One of the important things to keep in mind is the benefits of sun come from going from 0 to a little bit. That's where 90% of the benefits come from. Then the other piece that I think is important to keep in mind is that what we see really, really clearly across the board is that more time outside is associated with incredibly better health outcomes. Don't think about sunbathing. Think of it as minimizing your time indoors, because it's really clear that indoor life is not making us healthy. All that matters is get outside more. I boil it down to 7 words, which is get sun, not too much, go outside. And the go outside part is really important.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rowan Jacobsen, and you find the opportunity to read In Defense of Sunlight. You can learn more about In Defense of Sunlight and Rowan's other writings by visiting rowanjacobsen.com. Norton Productions would also like to announce the publication of Nature Revisited, Stories of Hope for a Planet and Its People. Nature Revisited, the book, is a collection and celebration of 20 interviews from the first 6 years of the podcast. People who are making a difference in the way we perceive our relationship with nature and the natural world, and who are helping to shape our future. It is beautifully illustrated by Minnesota artist Mark Granlund and is available through your local bookstore, nortonproductions.com, jeffryanauthor.com, or Amazon. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nortonproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.